The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions, gamers dominate the tabletop, and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Arma Class 3, taxes man plus 2.
And tonight we are joined by Lee Gold, folk songwriter, role player, game author, and longtime editor of the APA Alarums and Excursions. Welcome to the show, Lee.
Thank you.
So, to start off, Lee, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, my background's complex. I've got an MA in English Lit hidden in a closet somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I do. It's actually in a closet a couple of feet away from me. I've got a background in science fiction fandom, which is still continuing.
Mm-hmm.
I've participated over the years in a number of amateur press associations.
Mm-hmm.
Alarums and Excursions started when the Amateur Press Association, APA-L, which is collated at LASFS every week, a number of us started getting interested in Dungeons and Dragons.
Mm-hmm.
And as more and more of us started talking about Dungeons and Dragons, those of us in APA-L who were not interested in Dungeons and Dragons started saying, why don't you people start talking about this somewhere else?
Mm-hmm.
Because they said, you're talking about this other thing, which is not general science fiction fandom.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, I will nobly start a APA, which is just about Dungeons and Dragons and other role-playing interests.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, let's see. We could call it something, I could use a Shakespearean phrase.
Mm-hmm.
I could call it Alarums and Excursions, which is a phrase that Shakespeare used for people running on stage, banging drums and things, and then running off stage.
Mm-hmm.
And a long, long time ago, one great science fiction fan had mentioned that if you were going to start a fanzine, you should always start it with a phrase that started with an A, because that way, if people were going to review fanzines, they would probably do it in alphabetical order.
Very smart. Yes.
Yeah. So I chose a phrase that started with an A.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So
when was this? What year was this that you started?
1975.
Right. Okay.
In July.
Mm-hmm.
And shortly thereafter, my husband, Barry, we've been married in August of 69, got a opportunity we could not resist. His company said, why don't we send you off to Japan for 4 months?
Mm-hmm.
And we felt we could not turn that down.
Of course.
So, I mean, really, he was sent off to work with the Japanese equivalent of NASA
Mm-hmm.
at his regular salary plus a $40 a day per diem.
Mm-hmm.
To be put up in a suite, he and I, at the New Otani Hotel.
Right.
With a subway pass and a free thing that the company paid for, where they would pay for our dry cleaning. I mean, it was astonishing. And I found someone else who would run the APA while we were away.
Right.
And then we would come back after 4 months and see if the APA still existed. It did, which was nice.
Yes.
And so off we went to Japan after only bringing out 2 months. And I took my typewriter with us and typed stencils for both APA and Alarums and Excursions while we were away. And came back and found that in 4 months, only 3 issues of A&E had come out.
Right.
And I said, oh dear, and got out my ringmaster's whip and told everybody, it's coming out again. Everything is going to start happening again. Don't think that just because one issue didn't come out, it's over. And after that, it didn't. The only time it missed issues was for either pre-announced issues, like I said in 2006. Hey guys, I'm having a hysterectomy. We're going to miss an issue.
Oh, okay. That's a good excuse.
I thought so. And
just one issue. That's still that's pretty dedicated.
well, I thought if I announced it in advance, people might give me the right to skip one issue. It turned out they were very magnanimous. And
Yes.
last year I said, there's a Worldcon, the time that all science fiction fans like to try to get together in our backyard up in San Jose, and we'd like to go, and it was right on the weekend of our deadline, and I said, we're going to attend. But mostly it always comes out, deadline is the 21st of the month at 5 p.m. Los Angeles time, and I have everybody ritually trained that that's when deadline is, and that's when it happens. And so unlike Dragon, we keep our deadlines. We don't well, seriously, it's because I print on my own printer in my own house. I don't have to worry about outside printers.
Wow.
Unlike the Dragon, which has to deal with outside businesses.
Right.
And
right.
that does make a difference.
And then once it's printed, you mail it out to all the members?
Well, I mail it out to all the members and subscribers.
Right.
I collate it myself. Barry staples it, and it goes into envelopes. And deadline is on the 21st. It gets mailed probably on the next postage day.
Wow, that's dedicated. How many contributors and subscribers do you have now?
Not as many as we used to. About half of them go out by email instead of by snail mail these days.
Okay.
So we've got about 20 snail mail and maybe 30 or 40 email. There used to be a lot more before Different Worlds. Back before Different Worlds, I was getting a lot of copies that were being sold in shops. And I was printing 400 or more copies on paper.
Wow.
And they were sold in shops, some of them in England, some in Canada. I would get occasional letters from shops saying, why don't you send us 20 or 30 copies and we'll pay you for them in 2 or 3 months. Maybe. And I would say, I don't do business on maybes.
Yeah, exactly.
And I got the strangest letters from shops in Australia. Australian shops have this theory that if you agree to sell to us, you will promise not to do business with anyone else in the country.
Okay.
And not even subscribers.
Weird.
Yeah.
And you will give that shop a monopoly, not just in that particular state of Australia, but for everywhere in the entire country.
Huh.
Okay.
And I would say, no. And they would say, but that's how things are done in Australia. And I would say, not for me.
Right. Yeah.
I've never heard of that anywhere else.
I haven't either, but that's how things are now being done. And if
Mhm.
you talk to any friends you have in Australia, like by email, you will find that Australians are now being cut off by Amazon.
Huh.
That Amazon will no longer sell to Australians.
Wow.
That is so weird.
It's yes, and Amazon.au will no
Mhm.
longer ship to Australia. It's scary.
Huh.
And postage to Australia is very high.
Yes.
And Australians are really being cut off for buying things.
Right. Yeah.
And I don't understand how this works. Basically, if you have a friend who in Australia who happens to travel to the US
Mhm.
or Canada, they will buy a lot of stuff and try to import it safely and legally.
Right.
Mhm.
And it's really dicey.
Wow.
It didn't used to be like this. This is a new set of terms that are just happening in this last year or two that I'm hearing about by email from friends.
Mm.
And I don't understand it, and I may not have the terms absolutely correctly, but this is what I'm hearing by email from 2 or 3 friends in Australia.
Right. Well, if we have any Australian listeners, if you want to write in, go to obeythedna.com and leave a comment about this. We'd love to hear about this, if this is correct. And if if the situation is so bad in Australia at this point. Wow, that's crazy.
On the other hand, the Australian version of Project Gutenberg and the Canadian version of Project Gutenberg have totally different rules than the US version of Project Gutenberg.
Right.
And I find myself bookmarking all the different versions of Project Gutenberg.
Yes, because everyone has different copyright periods and therefore different materials. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's one of the wonderful things about different copyright laws.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to follow the American ones. I'm sorry, but America is the one that's gotten us into this copyright mess. So,
well, the British version is different, and in some cases stronger, and in some cases weaker than the American one. I just heard from a British filker saying that Robert Frost was still under copyright in some instances for some poems where he wasn't in America.
That's crazy.
Oh.
Did I say anything was sane?
No, ma'am, you did not.
Okay.
Wow.
Good.
That's fantastic. So anyway, back to
getting back to A&E.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So before I had left, I had started putting out Alarums and Excursions. Right. When I came back, I started writing about how various games applied to Japan and about some of these strange things. Because while we were in Japan, I had picked up a great deal of stuff, not just in the Japanese language, which we'd been there for 4 months. I'd had to learn to speak and read a certain amount of Japanese in order to run around there and make myself understood by walking around by myself. But I'd also picked up a great deal of stuff on Japanese folklore. And I was also following Chivalry and Sorcery a great deal. And the people who had written some Chivalry and Sorcery while also taking some of the rules that they incorporated in Chivalry and Sorcery from some other sources got interested in what I was writing and subscribed to A&E and started contributing to it. And so did Steve Perrin, who, as a science fiction fan, was very interested in this stuff and was contributing to A&E.
Right. Now, your original contributors, sorry to interrupt for a sec, but your original contributors to A&E, were they all basically just local people? Like they were the member in the area?
You have to understand that contributors to APA were not local to Los Angeles.
Okay.
APA contributors included not just Angelinos, but also people like Dick Eney of Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
uh, Mark Swanson and Glenn Blakeow of Boston,
Mm-hmm.
Paul Lieberman of Boston or New York. I'm sorry, I don't remember where she was at that time. And
Okay.
a number of other people. APA contained fans from New York and Boston and DC. And science fiction fandom at that point kept intensively in touch with one another by
Mm-hmm.
fanzine and by convention. We had regional conventions such as Westercon, which
Mm-hmm.
moved up and down the Pacific coast. And of course, we had Worldcon, which moved across uh, Pacific coast,
Mm-hmm.
Midwest, East Coast, and ideally, occasionally, somewhere international.
Right.
And so we stayed in touch by convention and fancy.
Mm.
And so there were people in APA across the world.
Wow. Now,
And
just in case any of our listeners are not familiar with APAs, could you explain what APAs are?
oh, uh, okay, you are to imagine me throwing my hands wildly about in the air and gesticulating as I do this.
Okay, sure, no problem. Just don't
Okay,
hit the desk, please, or table.
I will try not to. You're currently mounted on a tray table.
Okay.
Um, the standard APA
Mm-hmm.
has an official collator or mailer
Mm-hmm.
who gets people to either print their own fanzines or send them to him or her, and he or she prints them,
Mm-hmm.
and or gets someone else to print them,
Mm-hmm.
and might have 20 to 50 to 100 copies. And this fanzine might be 1 page or 50 pages.
Right.
And it will come out once a week or 4 times a year. And this mailer will then bundle all these fanzines together in a 9 by 12 envelope or something humongous and mail copies to all the contributors. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't want anything that minor. I wanted
Right.
something that would also have subscribers
Right.
and where the subscribers would support the contributors.
Makes sense.
Well, it was something that had never been tried before.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, I wanted to have something where there would be lots of subscribers and the contributors wouldn't have to pay anything for postage because the subscribers would join in and pay the postage for the contributors. And this was a whole new
Oh.
thing that had never been done before.
Hmm.
It was my entirely new and brilliant, I hoped, idea
Right.
where you would get all these people and people would say, oh, I've never thought of this, but I could start contributing. And therefore they would buy a few copies, a few issues,
Mm-hmm.
and then start contributing. And then more people, and it would snowball.
Right.
And it would become addictive to contribute to.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one reason that shops would stop carrying it, because they would get a few copies and
Mm-hmm.
start selling it. And then the people who bought it would stop buying it because they would start subscribing.
Driving.
But
Right.
other people would start buying it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was this strange new magazine. Imagine buying the Scientific American and then sending articles in and becoming a contributor.
Mm.
It was an alien type of magazine
Right.
that no one had ever tried doing before, but it people liked it, and it started growing. And the first thing that happened was we started out with like 30 or 40 pages. And then suddenly we were 100 pages. And then we were 150 pages. And then I said, I'm not doing more than 150 pages an issue because that's where we start running into being too expensive to mail.
Right.
And too difficult to staple.
Right.
Right.
And therefore, I said, we started running into, well, let's see. We have this many extra people who are going to be in next issue. And then I would say we have this many people who are backlogged into the issue after next issue.
Right.
And so it would get longer and longer. But nobody really objected because it was such fun.
Right.
And we had this suddenly wonderful snowballing effect, which I had dreamed of when I started it, but I didn't think it was actually going to happen, but it did. And it was great and wonderful fun for some wonderful times. And then after a few years, somewhere around the time Different Worlds got started, which was at the point that it wasn't just D&D anymore. Now, if you look up, you can probably find on the web the Dragon editorials that Mr. Gygax wrote.
Right.
And I think the Dragon 16 and 26, but it's been a long time, where Mr. Gygax started denouncing the APAs as unfair.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated. Oh, yes. He felt there were times that Mr. Gygax felt, look for jackals battening on a lion's kill.
Right.
Which was, I believe, partly the denunciation of alien games. You know, other gaming companies had no right to publish role-playing games.
Oh, okay.
That was a fascinating part of early Gary Gygax.
I have no idea.
Oh, well, I have been told. I never do. Okay, I now get to tell my only voice-to-voice encounter with Mr. Gygax.
Oh, please do.
Okay, this is strange. He called. Okay, he wrote me a letter, and I published it because that's what I did. You know? Right. He wrote me a letter. He wrote me a letter, and I published it. But before that, he phoned me, and I picked up the phone, and a voice said, "Can I talk to Lee Gold?" And I said, "This is Lee Gold." Now, this was my parents' fault. My parents named me before I was born, which in 1942 was much less common than it is these days, because in 1942 they did not have a way of telling when it
was going to be a boy or a girl. Yes.
Yeah, there was no way to know. But my mother got pregnant, and my parents, there was a war on in 42. My parents decided to buy a war bond. And so they picked a name that would go either way.
Smart thinking.
Oh, yeah. And my father's mother had been Leonora. And so they named me Lee. And so Gygax called up and he asked to speak to Lee Gold.
Right.
I said, "I'm Lee Gold." And he said, "You're a woman." And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "This is Gary Gygax." And I said, "Oh, Mr. Gygax, how nice to hear from you. We all love your game. It's wonderful. It's been such fun playing it. Thank you so much for writing it and publishing it." And he said, "You're a woman." And I said, "Yeah." And I gather you got the magazine I mailed you. And he said, "You're a woman." And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "I hope you like the copy of Alarms and Excursions I sent you." And he said, "You're a woman."
Wow.
I wrote some bad things about women war players once. And I said, "That's all right. I haven't read them. You don't have to feel embarrassed." And he said, "You're a woman." And we didn't seem to be getting anywhere, So I said,
Right.
"Well, I don't think we're getting anywhere. It's been nice to have talked to you, and I've got other things to do. Bye." And I hung up on him.
That's great.
Well, it's the only conversation I ever had with him. Anyway, he sent me a letter, and I published it in A&E. And
did his letter actually apologize for not being a very good conversationalist?
No, it didn't address the conversation. The way APAs work is that a zine, which is short for fanzine,
right.
A zine starts out with a title and your name, and it may have a paragraph or two about what you've been doing lately, and then it'll have comments. And the comments start with the name of the person you're commenting to.
Right.
It's not like a column in a magazine. It doesn't have comments. It doesn't, the paragraphs aren't about the topic. The paragraphs are addressed to who you're talking to. And poor Mr. Gygax didn't understand this, and so he thought that the boldface thing at the top of each paragraph was written by the name of the person, and so he got confused.
Okay.
And the letter reproached the person that he thought it was by, instead of reproaching the person that the zine was actually by. So he got very confused.
Right. Okay. No.
It means that the letter I wrote was all confuzzled, which is a shame. And so if the people who read his zines have to kind of debug them, which is a shame. And this was not his fault. He just wasn't used to APAs.
Right.
Yeah, because a lot of them, like the early A&Es, I've noticed, they read like the minutes of a meeting, that there's this constant back and forth, and I know that's
and
sorry, go ahead.
It's all comments. Yeah.
Because it's as I recall, because I'm kind of an on again, off again member of an APA too, and what it kind of is it's sort of like what we call nowadays like a virtual meeting place. It's a chance for all of these folks to compare ideas. And that's why they tend to read, if you're not used to the format, it tends to read a little weird because it looks like little teeny tiny articles directed at one specific person.
Okay.
I like to think of it as being like going into a cocktail party.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I tell people that comments are the lifeblood of an APA, and you really need to get 2 or 3 issues and follow the comment chains to know what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, because that's another, that reminds me of the earliest days of tabletop gaming. A lot of the magazines, even the professional ones, like say your White Dwarf or your Dragon, they still worked a lot like that it really felt that you weren't reading like a magazine. It was kind of like a newsletter for a closed community, because there would be constant references to other things that everybody would take as a matter of fact, that if you weren't if you hadn't been part of the hobby for a bit, you wouldn't know who this person was everybody's referencing, or they'd reference articles from other magazines. Yeah, and if you hadn't seen that magazine, like I got into it in the late 70s, and we kind of got sporadic, like supplements and books. So I'd see references to all these different things that everybody's been talking about for a long time, but because I wasn't there and didn't have access to it, it tends to be a little bit baffling for a while.
And that's why it was so nice when the Dragon, for a while at least, was selling the complete run on a DVD.
Yeah. Because that was a big help, because I remember reading Dragon around issue 40, I think is when I started. There were constant references to an article from it was like issue 20, somewhere in like the 20s.
Yeah.
It was the article about female characters.
Oh God. Yes.
And
that was by Sam Conkin, and he also published that in A&E.
Yeah. Because it was one of those things that I got into this, and there was this heated debate going on in a number of magazines, and I had no way to access this original article until like the late 90s when I got that CD set. And there was a lot of that kind of, for better or worse, community feel to the early days.
And if you still have that CD, I had an article in Dragon 1 called "Can You Speak Old Wormish?"
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That was by me.
Wow. Yeah, I remember that.
That's amazing.
And I walked up and found that one early on, and I said, "So, are you people giving away free copies of the magazines that people have articles in, which used to be considered good manners?"
Right, yes.
And they said, "Oh, I guess so." And I said, "Thank you. That's my name in there." And they said, "Oh, I guess you're entitled to a copy." I said, "Thank you," and took it. Well, they had forgotten that little detail.
Yeah.
Well, you know.
So where did this conversation take place? Or is this...
I never went to a Dragon Con, but this was at an Origins. Or either an Origins or an Origins West. I forget which.
Right. Well, Lee, let's take a step back for a second then.
Sure.
So how did you first get exposed to role-playing games?
Okay. We have friends.
Mm-hmm.
We've been lucky. We have friends.
Right.
Owen and Hilda Hannafin, who were old-time members of LASFS that my husband had. I guess I should start with, so Lee, how did you get into LASFS?
Yeah, okay. Let's explain what LASFS is, just for our audience that don't know what the acronyms mean.
Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society.
There we go.
Back in 1974, I was standing at the UCLA bookstore in front of the science fiction section. And so were three guys. And we started talking about the books. What about that one? Do you like this one? Have you gotten that one yet? 4 hours later, an employee came up and said, "We're about to close the student store. You have to leave." We do? Yes. When we close the store, people have to leave. You can't stay here all night until we open it again in the morning. Oh. So they threw us out. And we said, well, that was fun. You know, we should try to do it again on purpose. Maybe not in the store. I said, well, I have an apartment. I'm actually in 74. I was all of, pardon me, not 74, 64. In 64, I was all of 22 years old, and I was a teaching assistant and in the English department. And so I said, I have an apartment and a job. And they said, well, we're all freshmen. I said, well, we could form a science fiction club, and we could have meetings once a month and talk about science fiction. And they said, that sounds good. So we put up a sign on a bulletin board saying, want to talk about science fiction? And we got a name. We were the third foundation, which, would follow after the second.
Right.
And people came to us and told us all about the local science fiction club and how they met every week on Thursday night.
Right.
And charge dues. We don't charge dues.
Right.
And they didn't talk about science fiction. They talked about fandom. We talk about science fiction. And we decided we like our club better.
Right.
Some of us went over and started attending this LASFS, Los Angeles Science Fantasy Society.
Yes.
We liked ours better. So after a while, we went off and attended Westercon, which was held in 68 on the July 4th weekend. We had little badges which said the Third Foundation. I and another guy took little hairnets, and I put gold pipe cleaners attached to them, so we would look like slans.
Right.
And a woman led us up to A. Van Vogt.
Oh, wow.
And introduced us. And he said, very well done. And I found that hotel had a telephone booth with a glass door that would pull out around the telephone. And I put a sign in it that said, just deposit 25 cents and close the glass door on the ethical suicide booth. And you will be terminated. And someone kept removing the note there on reason. And I can't think why. And we created this fanzine, We created this 40-page fanzine called The Third Foundation, issue 77, with the first installment of a new novel, which I had written, called Doomed Lensman. You can find on the web the entire novel.
I'll link to it in the show notes.
If you search for Doomed Lensman by Sibley White, in which all the Lensmen are killed, chapter by chapter.
Okay. You had something against Lensman, did you?
No, I loved the Lensman. I just felt the next logical thing was creating a great sequel. People were fascinated by this, especially I think when I brought on Mark Duquesne, and he picked up a lens on Arisha. I can't describe it. You'll have to read it in order to see what it's like. But
now, Mark Duquesne, was that the guy from Skylark of Space?
Yes. And he created a new Skylark built around a giant pulsating lens.
Oh, I see. Okay, that would work. Yeah.
It's an absolutely insane book. I loved writing it. Anyway, Steve Golden was a member of this group who went on to write some other sequels to E.E. Smith things as well. Anyway, so we made our entry as the Third Foundation to LASFS in August of 1967, which is when I first met Barry, and 2 years later I married him. We went in, the first issue had some folk songs, including "Oh, What a Beautiful Martian," and my first memory of Barry is his singing it.
Oh, wow.
So
is that how he won your heart, by singing your songs?
Not that I noticed.
Okay.
But he did have a nice voice.
Okay.
Anyway, so some of the people there included the Hannafins.
Mm-hmm.
And the Hannafins later moved to San Francisco. And then they came down again because Hilda thought that her father might be dying, only he wasn't. So she said, as long as we're down in LA, we just found a new thing called Dungeons and Dragons. And as long as my father isn't dying, we want to tell you about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to run a game for you. So she had a dungeon, and she ran Dungeons and Dragons for us. And they said, we will give you photocopies of the rules if we see you write a check to TSR for a copy of the rules.
Sounds fair.
And mail it to them. And we wrote a check and put it in an envelope and mailed it to TSR. And after they saw us put it in the mailbox, they gave us a photocopy of the rules. And I then made up a dungeon called Neocarn, and which had 3 whole levels. And I started running games, and my set of the rules, this was in 75, I think, or late 74. My set of the rules arrived a few weeks later.
Right, and this would be first edition Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah, this is the wood grain box.
Right.
Which, as I wrote you the other day, had 4,000 copies printed before they started printing the white box.
Wow.
And so that was how we got into playing D&D. Now, this was not the first role-playing game. Years before that, a year or two before that, we had been playing Dynasty, which was this big red cylinder box set in China, where there were 8 white pamphlets that all looked exactly the same. The emperor, the official, the warlord, the gentry landholder, 4 peasants, and they all were, each with their own psychology. And each of them said, as long as I play the game, my actions will conform to this person's personality.
Right.
Which is the essence of role-playing, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And you can find it. My write-up of role-playing in APA mentions this game, and it's the first role-playing game I'm familiar with. There may be others, but it's the first one I know that was sold.
Right. That's fascinating. I had no idea.
Yeah.
It's on the web. It's weird. And like all role-playing games I know, the rules needed tinkering. And all the role players I know, when we looked at Gary Gygax's game with its percent and liar and all its typos, everybody I know said, this stuff needs tinkering.
Yeah.
Ken St. Andre looked at it and wrote Tunnels and Trolls, and the people in Michigan wrote their thing, and the people in Caltech wrote their thing, and Steve Perrin wrote his thing. Everybody tinkered D&D because it needed tinkering to be playable.
Right.
And Gygax looked at the original thing which wasn't really his, it was Blackmore, and he had to tinker it to make it playable.
Right.
Yeah. And the nice part about D&D was it obviously needed player help. Well, obviously, to all the players I knew.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, why do you say that was the nice thing about it?
Well, that it wasn't like Monopoly or Parcheesi or something that you just played it the way it came out of the box. That everybody obviously knew that we were all going to be in this together.
Oh, okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So there was a cooperative spirit to the game right from the beginning. Both
certainly. I've been in some games where it was the GM versus the players, and I didn't find that agreeable. I don't know if you've ever played in a game like that.
Yep,
but
I've been in games like that. Yeah. Some GMs take a more adversarial approach.
Yeah, and I would say, well, thank you. Here's my character sheet, and walk off and find someone else.
Yeah, because that's when you talk about the very earliest days of D&D, you're right that it needed tinkering, because you pretty much couldn't learn the game just by buying a book. You needed either to sit down with the group and kind of hash it out, or somebody who'd been experienced teaching you.
Yeah.
And it's kind of one of the things I think a lot of modern gamers miss, getting with what you were saying, is that the game would come out, and it wasn't until, I would say, probably like you get into the 80s, people were publishing role-playing games, that the game, it was essentially in and of itself complete. So you did have a lot of input, and you had this weird nebulous realm where a lot of things the participants would just assume, because they'd all come from the same kind of fantasy background or science fantasy background. And they would figure, so D&D mentioned hobbits, what became halflings after a couple of lawsuit threats. And there's no real description of what a halfling does with their time, but everybody coming in had read Tolkien and was just read into that. They were assuming that, well, they obviously live in a shire, and they do this, and they like to eat, and they're not necessarily adventurers, and they're all little thieving guys with hairy feet. And it's interesting to see because I came in at kind of the edge of that. And it was interesting to see how, everywhere you went, even like a groups playing in the same area, the games were always very different, because everybody is bringing so much of themselves and their own ideas into the experience.
Yep, that's true. My favorite for that was Superhero 2044. Which I think was the first superhero role-playing game, which is basically just rules for statistics, and then it just has this section that says, and make up some superpowers. And that's it. It literally, and there's a combat system. But they just tell you, make up your own superpowers. Just whatever the GM thinks is okay is fine.
Yeah.
And that's okay. All right. That's pretty do-it-yourself, but okay, sure, why not?
Try to make it sort of balanced.
Yeah, exactly.
And it never really, balancing speed versus anything else was always dicey. We're still trying to get people to balance speed. How do you manage to have one person do 100 actions in the same amount of time that the other people are doing one action?
Right. That's true. So do you play any superhero role-playing games, Lee?
Not to my knowledge.
Not to your knowledge. Okay.
I am doing stuff in the Norse myths.
Oh, okay.
Now, in the Norse myths, I sit down and explain to my sweet, darling, wonderful players, no, you are not going to get any input from Marvel.
Right.
I don't care how many Marvel comics, movies, TV shows you've seen. I am working off of the myths, Wikipedia, and all the books I've got of the myths and folklore. I am not working off of anything having to do with any of the stuff you've read that's modern day.
Right.
Trust me, because if you use any Thor that's got yellow hair instead of red, if you use anything that doesn't correspond to my imagination, you're wrong. And what's more, my imagination is far weirder than anything you've got, because in my imagination, Odin and Loki are conspiring in ways you couldn't possibly dream up.
Ooh. Okay.
And they are pulling the wool off of over everybody's eyes because they want to prevent Ragnarok.
Right.
And so everything you've read is a lie.
Right.
And just trust me, it's all false. And my players look at me and say, but, I say, trust me. They're all lying. They've been all lying to you. Balder is the evil guy, and it's all lies.
Right.
And they've gotten almost used to this by now. But it's when I told them that Balder was a myth invented by the Christians, they said, but, and I said, trust me, it's all a lie. And this game has been going on with occasional drifts off to the 35th century asteroids and 15th and 12th century Japan and other strange things for about 25 years.
Oh my.
Well, yeah. And my players have almost gotten used to it by now.
Almost. Well, okay. Well, they had trouble keeping up with you, obviously.
Well, yeah, I'm strange.
Okay. So what system do you use for this?
Well, I wrote this game called Lands of Adventure.
Right.
It's strange, too. And anytime I wrote another game, like Vikings for Iron Crown, before I would ship it out, I would translate it all into Lands of Adventure to make sure that everything was still there.
Okay.
Okay. And Lands of Adventure basically is a cheap and fast system which is designed to make sure that there's a minimum of rolling and a maximum of role playing, which is why we have a 3-hour game.
Right.
Which gives me about 3 pages of notes of action.
Right. Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay.
So this is the one that was published in 1983 by Fantasy Games Unlimited.
Yeah. And the idea was to have lots of player action, a certain amount of GM NPC action, and very, very little dice rolling.
Right.
One of the things I did, because I wanted some input, I don't know, you guys were in Japan, you say, when I was in Japan, I picked up...
He wasn't, but anyway.
Okay. I picked up the Toyo Kanji, which is 2,000 ideographs.
Yes.
And I roll a D2000 for what's going to happen next.
Okay.
Wow.
So that's the 2,000 most basic kanji characters.
Yeah.
And then what do you do once you have one of the Toyo 2000?
I kind of trip on it about the same way I would if I was rolling the I Ching. And I say, okay, that's what's going to happen next.
Something connected with that kanji that you just rolled up. Okay, sure, why not?
Yeah. I mean, it gives me something weird to trip off of.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. That's an interesting approach. Do you also use the I Ching?
I did when I was running stuff sometimes in Japan, but the I Ching takes longer to roll because you're rolling 6 different things
Right.
And then there's moving lines, and it takes longer than just rolling.
Right.
A D20, a D10, and a D10 are a lot faster.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And I like to go fast.
I can see that. So you're definitely a rules light kind of person. You like to keep the rules light and the focus just on the imagination and the playing aspects.
Yep. And I say, okay, let's get this game happening. And if I could, I would roll these things in advance, but I found that doesn't work as well. And so I try to what I really try doing, if I can, I know my NPCs, and I think, so what's Loki going to plan on doing next? Oh, what's Scotty, Thrym's daughter, who's one of the people who's one of my NPCs? What's the jester of the Elfhill? What are his plans? What's the weather? Well, let's see. It's January 5th. What's the weather going to do next? Oh,
Right.
there could be a blizzard. That's perfectly reasonable.
Right. And so you said you've been doing this for 30 plus years.
Yeah.
Has obviously your players group has changed except for maybe your husband, or is he the only consistent player during that period?
Oh, well, we've got some people who've been around for 20 years or so.
Right. Oh, the kids. Yeah.
No. They're not kids. We don't have any children.
Okay.
We've got, let's see, Rita Prince Winston moved out here some 1984.
Right.
And she's been in the game since. We lost some people. They died.
Yeah.
John Redden moved out to Hawaii, but we still have him via Discord.
Right.
Rick Schwall moved to Berkeley. We've still got him by Discord. Joshua Cronengold and Lisa Paddle, we found them in Filking and A&E, and they're in New York City, but they introduced us. First, we were using Skype and then Hangout, and now Discord.
Okay.
You know, I love modern technology. Nice stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot to like.
Yeah. I had to start explaining. At first, I just said Discord brought us together, and some people thought I was making bad puns.
Right.
So now I say Discord, Perrin, that's VOIP.
Yeah.
Opposed Perrin, because not even people who understand things don't fully understand that old-fashioned people in their 70s can be using voice over internet protocol. And I admit I'm not doing it. That's my husband. My husband was working on ARPANET when I first met him.
Wow.
He was working, Rand Engineering spun off one of its branches to become System Development Corporation, and Barry was employed there. Out in Santa Monica.
Right.
And Barry worked at SDC and then at some other interesting places like NCR and Northrop and other things. And eventually he retired. And now he just kind of works for me.
Okay, well, the toughest boss he has.
Yeah.
So to go back, sorry to interrupt, but let's go back to Alarms and Excursions just to finish it on up. So you've obviously had many contributors to Alarms and Excursions over the years. Right. Have there been any noteworthy things that were published in A&E first and then went on to be published as full role-playing games or supplements or other things?
I'm trying to think. Well, let's see. my notes on nitpicking and discussing stuff for CNS supplements later were published in the CNS source book.
CNS would be Chivalry and Sorcery?
Chivalry and Sorcery.
Yep.
And also, a number of things. Steve Jackson Games for some years, well, they're still subscribing. Steve Jackson Games for some years data mined people who were contributing to A&E and used to sometimes contact them and say, we've been following what you've been writing, and would you like to write something for us? Which I thought was very sweet of them, and so did the people they contacted.
Well, you did work for Steve Jackson Games as well. You wrote GURPS Japan.
I did. And it was a somewhat odd relationship. I did not get the contract until the day it was finished. I would write them and say, for your information, I am 60% done. I still haven't gotten your contract. And I thought I would reassure you and tell you that you're not going to see word one of what I have written until I get the contract.
Right.
And I have now finished 80% of this game, and I'm not going to send it to you until I get the contract, and so on. I don't know if you ever saw The Familiar, which was edited, I can't remember if his first name was Edmund or Edward, but by an E. Wilson. It was a wonderful magazine.
No.
And I wrote an article for him called Golems and Gematria, a guide to role-playing Jewish characters.
Oh, wow.
And if you go to the webpage Alarums and Excursions, you'll find a link to it because I put it up on the webpage. And writing that was wonderful. I would send it to him, and he would write back and say, would you please write me another 1,000 words more about this or that? And he was paying me, I don't remember, 2, 3, 4 cents a word.
Oh, that's pretty
and
good.
So everything more he wanted, I would be getting another $50, $10 or $20 more. And I would say, are you sure? Yes. Okay. And so eventually we got it finished to our mutual satisfaction. And when it finally came out, I got this email from a guy, Dear Lee, I work for the Jewish Educational Council of St. Louis, and this is the best introductory article I've ever seen on Judaism. I am Jewish. Would you please give me permission to print this so I can hand it out to people who come in to our office and ask us what is Judaism?
Oh, wow.
And I said, no. I am not going to give you permission to hand out things on talking to werewolves and sentient plants to people who come in and running off on spaceships, to people and talking to poison ivy plants, to people who come in to your office. I'm going to write you a special version of this that doesn't have fantasy and science fiction. Oh, and no demons.
Probably a good idea.
I mean, we've had enough trouble with demons, thank you. Thanks to the press hysteria about that poor guy and the steam tunnels, remember?
Right, yes, yeah.
Oh, God. And I said, I'm going to write you a special version without demons and poison ivy, talking to poison ivy plants, and whether you're allowed to talk to werewolves and then eat them. And all the things I had put in there for role players. I said, I'm going to write you a special mundane version of this article just for you.
Right.
And I did, and I gave it to him. but the original version is up on the web. And if you go to the A&E webpage, you can find the original version.
So there's a great question then. Are werewolves kosher?
No.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's good to know.
Bad animals are only kosher if they split the hoof and chew cod.
Oh, there we go.
It says so in Leviticus.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Fish are only kosher if they have fins and scales.
Right.
I mean, it's a very simple system. Human beings are not kosher. You may not kill human beings and eat them. I'm going to tell you that first off. And most of the other questions were Jews will argue about it.
Right.
But, but it was a fun article to write.
I bet.
Really fun. And getting paid for it was even more fun. And the original article had great illustrations in the Familiar. I think it was Familiar before. Anyway, I had a lot of fun writing these articles.
I bet.
Oh, God, yes. And there was another one that I wrote for a British fanzine, which I don't remember whether it's up there or not, about professional role player. I don't really know what the right term would be. The fact that professional role player games don't want to address homosexuality. And we don't write about it.
Right.
We don't write about it. White Wolf didn't address it. I would have thought they would have.
You would think, yeah.
And they didn't.
I think they did later on, but I think again that was like the early 2000s.
When I wrote a thing about Gaki for White Wolf, which sort of casually mention. If you look at it, you'll notice that my article on the Gaki makes it look like the character is bisexual without ever using the term. And did not really say so. And I offered them an article. I said, let me lure you into the 21st century and offer you an article on characters with the electronic mastery who can give you characters who can go into computers and do laptops and cell phones. And they said no.
Okay.
And why? I don't know, they didn't want to tell me why, but I've still got that article on my computer. But I offered them electronic mastery and they didn't want it. I still think it could have been fun, and I don't know why they were scared of it.
What do you remember what year that was you wrote that?
Oh, somewhere in the 80s.
Oh, because I was gonna say in the 90s, Palladium did a game that featured aliens that did that, but that wasn't until like the end of the 90s.
I was always a little odd.
And ahead of the curve.
Apparently.
Yeah.
Because
it's interesting you talk about addressing something like homosexuality, because gaming in general, I don't think sexuality has been a big component, other than some TNA in the artwork.
There's always been this in the Norse and the Greek cultures. It was always there as something where, the Greeks was always a component of Greek culture, was always a component of Norse culture as a way that people would insult each other. And nobody wanted to talk about it.
Right.
That's true.
And I don't know, people, I would look at it, I would see it, and if you don't want to talk about it, I can't make you talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right. But I would argue that gaming, at least American gaming, and that's where role-playing games developed, right?
Yeah.
Reflects American culture, which is super squeamish about sex in general.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you just don't, it's something that you just don't talk about in general. So therefore, gaming itself doesn't go in that direction, except in a very, very few situations.
Actually, no, it's not that they don't talk about it. They only want to talk about it as, oh, women are desirable, so we'll talk about women being desirable.
There's that. That's true.
And that's it.
Yeah, that goes back to that Dragon article.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very true.
And as a woman who might want to talk about occasionally men being desirable, but that wasn't something that anyone wanted to mention.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that there are a number of all-female gaming groups that talk about that all the time. It's just that the majority of role-playing gamers are straight men for the most part, or at least they were. I'm not sure if that's still true, but generally that seems to have been true. And therefore, that's what they're interested in.
I guess. I don't know. When I went to an Origins to publicize Land of the Rising Sun, what I saw was hucksters selling T-shirts that said, "I am a war game widow."
Right.
Barry was back in our hotel room with a fever, not a bad one,
right?
About 100.5.
Oh wow! Okay.
Well, not bad.
Right.
And
Okay.
I gave him aspirin and said, I got a game to run. I had a demo.
Right.
And I picked up my briefcase and trotted off to the convention facility. And as I entered, a guy of maybe 18 came up to me and said, "Are you carrying those books for your husband?" I said,
God.
"No, I'm carrying them for myself. I have a demo to run in about an hour, and I want to find the room." And he said, "Can I carry them for you?" I said, "Well, you don't need to. They're not that heavy, but if you want to, you can carry some of them." And I handed him some of them. And we went trotting off. I don't remember what the room name was, but we went off and we found it. It was a strange little room. The ceiling came down to about 5.5 feet over the table.
Oh, that's odd.
I said it was strange, so I put my stuff down there and I sat down at the table and I threw my head back and I said, "Wahaha," and the ceiling echoed. You know, wahaha is what
that's pretty good.
Monsters say in Japan in the cartoons.
Yep.
And it echoed. And I said, "Wow." And the guy said, as I put my stuff down and set everything up, he said, "Would your husband mind if I kissed you on the cheek?" And I said, "That's the wrong question." He said, "Oh, what's the right question?" I said, "The right question is, would you mind?" He said, "Oh, would you mind if I kissed you on the cheek?" I said, "You may kiss me on the cheek." So he kissed me on the cheek. He turned bright red and he ran out of the room. Wasn't that cute?
Yes.
And I thought, well, he might make some girl a good boyfriend someday. At least I've started him out knowing the right person to ask. And I have no idea whatever happened to him.
Right.
Wow.
And in about half an hour or so, my players who had signed up for the game, all of whom I knew, it turned out, showed up, and I said, hi. And I introduced them to their objective, which was to get some grain to a starving village in spite of the demon, who would say, Wahaha.
Right, of course.
And they all shuddered as it echoed through the room.
Right.
And after the second time I said it, they said, Lee, you don't have to say that anymore. We're all scared already.
Right.
It was a great game. And
Right.
they said, where's Barry? And I said, he's got a fever. And they said, oh, we hope he gets better. And I said, it's only 100.5. It's all right. And it was fun. By the next day, Barry was well again.
That's good.
You know.
Well, he obviously made it through.
Yeah. I've always felt self-confident about this stuff. I've always been fine. I don't know. I understand that some women get scared of stuff, and I have been scared on occasion of certain things, but not of running games and not of being up in front of a crowd and you know, not of that kind of stuff. Of singing off key. I've been scared of singing off key, which is why I only sing when Barry is singing along with me. I know I can sing off key because I know I do it sometimes. One of the songs I wrote, which may not have made it to Canada, I wrote a song to the tune of Waltzing Matilda called You Bash the Balrog and I'll Climb the Tree.
I have not heard that one. You should be recording these and putting them on YouTube.
You'll find the lyrics on the web, and
I'll see if I can find them for the show notes.
Yeah, and Barry recorded it on a filk tape at some point, and you know, it's an obvious. Once a jolly cleric and a magic-using elf and a mighty dwarf with a sword +3 left their native village out to get their share of pelf. You bash the Balrog and I'll climb the tree. You know.
That's great.
And, you know, and they... Hang on a second. I will go find Barry and get him to help with this one.
Oh, okay, sure.
There!
This is an interesting interview.
Come and sing Balrog.
It's okay. He doesn't have to.
Oh, I think he does.
Okay.
The next verse starts, first they met a tribe. First they met a Balrog, a goblin.
Okay,
You don't need the guitar.
good.
Sing.
Sing. First they met a goblin with a fire-breathing hound.
They bashed and they smashed and they scragged him with glee.
Afterwards they searched him and a magic potion found. You bash the Balrog and I'll climb the tree. You bash the Balrog, you bash the Balrog, you bash the Balrog and I'll climb the tree. Afterwards they searched him and a magic potion found. You bash the Balrog and I'll climb the tree.
Well,
Afterwards they searched him in a magic potion.
Lord
Wisdom swordsman picked it up and drank it down. Changed to a wolf immediately. No one could dispel it, so they headed back toward town. You bash the Balrog and I'll climb the tree.
Then a loud voice bellowed, who has slain the Goblin King? Round turned our heroes, what did they see? Swooping down upon them was a Balrog on the wing. You bash the Balrog and I'll climb the tree. Now, I have to note, you can't see us, that when we sing, you bash the Balrog, we point at people in the audience. And they point at one another. Okay?
Right.
They ran through the forest, searching for a place to hide, pursued by the Balrog so fierce to see. Wait, cried the elf mage, I have got a plan. He lied. You bash the Balrog and I'll climb the tree.
Once a
Now,
mighty Balrog
slew a cleric and an elf, and a mighty dwarf
who had
teeth plus three, skinned them and tanned their hides, and kept them on a closet shelf. You bash the Balrog and I'll climb the tree.
Not bad.
Now that got published in A&E number, I don't remember, 11 or 12 or somewhere in there.
Right.
Right. So that's one of my role-playing games songs.
How often do you perform that song?
Well, not very often, but it's a classic.
Right. Okay. Do you and Barry still perform at conventions or any events?
Yeah. Sure.
And how did you first get involved with filk singing then?
Well, as I said, I put a filk song in my first fanzine, which was published in August of '67. And that was, oh, what a beautiful Martian. Oh, what a lovely E.T. I've got an uneasy feeling. She's got a big crush on me.
Right. Wow. Nice.
Now, that is not the best one I've written. It's perhaps one of the worst ones I've written.
All right.
But
what would be your best then?
Well, there are a lot of much better ones. Let's think. I find myself, there are a number of good ones. Greetings, Professor. It's good to have you back again. I've scanned all of the interviews you gave the press. You will find, oh God, I'd have to get the words.
It's okay.
Let's see, there's one about the moon is a harsh mistress, which was the one I just started. There's one about, I rather like writing ones about books, other people's books. There's one that I'm rather fond of about Bridge of Birds. If you haven't read Bridge of Birds by Larry Hugert, I could tell you that Larry Niven says it's a perfect book.
Oh, wow. I've not read it myself. I'll definitely look it up.
Right. Yes.
We have Kitten.
It's apparently, 7:15 or something out here?
It's about 6:45.
We have guests coming over. I may want to stop relatively soon.
No problem.
I write some serious stuff and some funny stuff. I don't know. We could try doing this again some other night as well, some other Tuesday night as well. But I've written some stuff that people like and applaud, and some stuff people think is funny, and some stuff that is serious. And I don't know. And sometimes they applaud.
I'm sure they do. Your songs are very creative. Okay, since we're gonna have to finish up then, Dawn, did you have any questions you wanted to ask before Lee has to go?
One thing I was wondering, because you've been part of fandom for a while.
Yeah.
Have you noticed any trends amongst the fans in particular, like any changes or
They're
any
getting
groups
older. They're getting older. No, seriously, we're not drawing in younger people as much as we used to. And that's bad.
Definitely. Why do you think we're not drawing in the younger people?
I don't know.
Right.
I mean, I could make guesses. I could make wild guesses, but I really don't know. Some of it is that science fiction has gone mainstream. And we used to be that people would need to go and search for weird people like themselves. And now you don't need that as much because more and more people are watching science fiction on television.
Right.
And it's more mainstream. And they don't think that they need to as much to go and find people like themselves anymore. I don't know.
That makes sense. Well,
as much. It seems to me that finding good science fiction is just as hard as it ever used to be.
Maybe more so now, with so much of it being self-published through Amazon, Kindle Direct and everything. You've got so much science fiction out there that's just going direct to the market, and we don't even have the big publishers pushing it or marketing it anymore.
Right. The main stuff that I'm finding that suits me these days is Miller and Lee's Liaden stuff, Liaden books, which is sort of mingled Hare Regency romances and space, and is very strange and peculiar and fun. I used to be very fond of Cage Baker, but she died on me of cancer.
That's a problem.
Well, she didn't get my permission, and she wanted to die, but she died. And she wrote. She was the one who wrote the Company series, starting with In the Garden of Eden, and she wrote again strange. I like strange books, but she wrote.
I can tell.
Yeah, and she wrote strange and wonderful stuff, but. She wrote a series of, I think it was more than 12 books, but it's over now.
Right.
And she did at least manage to finish it before she died, which is good.
Yes, very good. The alternative would be very bad.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. I think it's the internet that's probably affected fandom. When you could argue even that fandom is actually bigger than it ever was. It's just scattered into a million little pockets over the internet instead of groups of people meeting anymore.
Maybe. I think that Bujold's books aren't, that they kind of petered out rather than being finished. And I did not like the last two in her original For Patrol and series as much as the first dozen or so.
Yeah, the first ones were great. They really were.
And then somehow or other along the line, it just kind of felt like she was pushing herself, and it just wasn't as good anymore.
Right. Yeah, unfortunately, I'd agree with you on that one.
Anyway.
Okay. Yes.
Okay, this has been wonderful, and maybe we can do it again sometime, but we've been talking for almost, an hour and a half?
And we appreciate your time, Lee. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening, and take care of yourself. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
And thank you, listeners, for listening to the show. We hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for coming on the show, Lee. Good night, everyone. Bye. Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya!